Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the RMS Public Sector Group's last event of 2022. And I'm very pleased to welcome Rob Barth, who's going to talk to us a little bit about managing M365 on an E3 license, which I suspect most people are in that position where their organisations haven't yet seen the benefit of going for the E5 license. The recording will be made available after the event, but it will be a few weeks as always because of the amount of work that needs to take place to get the recordings ready for publication. And I know that Rob's got content to share with us, so I will hand over to him. If you can put your questions in the questions tab, if you are able to get to the questions tab. I know on mobile devices it's not always very straightforward, or if you can put it in the chat. So I'm now going to hand over to Rob without any more ado.
Hello everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Elizabeth. Hope you're going to hear me. So yes, feel free to put questions in the chat or put questions in the questions section, and we'll try and answer them whenever we can. But yeah, Elizabeth, thank you for your invitation. I'm really glad to be here and great to see such a large number of people here. So I will be speaking around the slightly thorny subject of managing records with an E3 license. And I can imagine that many of you joining this call are probably in the situation where you're stuck on an E3 license or similar other lower licenses that don't give you access to some of the more advanced retention capabilities of Microsoft 365. And I'm not going to promise any miracles in this session because, you know, there's only so much we can do. But what I'm hoping to do is at least make this a cathartic thing where we can share each other's pain to a certain extent. But I want to take you through what is available in terms of records management with E3 licenses. And then I want to start looking at the gap. What are we actually missing out on? And then following on from that, what I'd like to do is look at some of the main models that I've seen different organizations starting to use. So if you are using an E3 license, exploring some of those perhaps very high level architectures and the pros and cons around them of the ways that you might be able to get something out of an E3 license. And finally, there's a few, I'm not going to say they're going to solve your problems, but a few little tricks and hints that might start pointing you towards things that you can do to potentially extend or build upon an environment that has E3 licenses to perhaps get slightly more out of it. But fingers crossed, there should be something in this session for everyone, I hope. Yes, I'm not going to, I can see the comments around the fact that some people are saying that they can't move from E5 because they've got so many users. You see, the number of users, the cost, I'm sure most of you on this call are very aware. If you've got, you know, thousands or even tens of thousands of users, the cost difference becomes eye-watering. I'm sure many of you have looked at it and say if you've got, I don't know, about 7,000 or 8,000 users, it's something like £400,000 or £500,000 extra that you're looking to for the uptick in licensing. And it's often quite a hard sell, shall we say, internally. Because you put together a business case, and of course, in many areas of Microsoft 365, the E3 license gives you everything. It gives you really rich capabilities in terms of Teams and, you know, the Office suite, for example. So the areas where very often the E3 licenses fall down are areas such as telephony or areas such as, unfortunately, retention. And so certainly from a business case point of view, it can be incredibly lonely experience trying to convince a large organization that actually there's value in moving to the higher licenses. But certainly, just to promise you before I do move in, I'm not here to try and sell you E5 licenses. That's not my job. Certainly, that's entirely your own decision if you do decide to go in that direction. Okay, so feel free to ping any questions. I can't actually see any questions, so if there's anything urgent that people need, Elizabeth, feel free to interrupt me and let me know. Okay, before I get in, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with me. You're probably sick of me, most of you, to be fair. But I'm Rob. I'm a Microsoft 365 solution architect, and I've done nothing but SharePoint and Microsoft 365 now for about 15 years or so. And in the last 7 of that, I've almost exclusively gone to focusing upon information governance and information management projects. And in that time, I've been lucky enough to work with some great clients and built out some of the largest retention capabilities, I guess, retention-based solutions for really large organizations around the UK. So feel free to reach out with me. I've still got my list, I'm looking up at the big screen on my side, by the way, but I've still got my Twitter handle. I've just realized on there, I've almost entirely abandoned my Twitter account over recent events, but do feel free to follow me on LinkedIn if you will reach out. I'm happy to answer anyone's questions at any stage. Okay, so let's start off. What do we actually get with an E3 license with regard to the retention capabilities, the records management capabilities? And I'm sure most of you on this call probably already know the answer to this. You've got, firstly, the concept of retention policies, which, for those who don't know, they're the sort of broad brush, one-size-fits-all approach to retention in Microsoft 365. The way that they work is you apply a policy to, say, the whole of a SharePoint site, or the whole of a user's inbox, or the whole of a OneDrive account. And the same rules that you've defined in that policy then apply to all of the content inside that area. The whole of the site is subject to the same policy. You've also got, again, I don't need to really mention this because these have been around for 6 years now, but you've also got retention labels. But notice I'm calling them here manual retention labels, because really with E3 licenses, the only way you get to apply them, out of the box at least, is manually. Each item is classified individually with a retention label. And certainly when you're looking almost at these two, with E3 licenses, they're both very rudimentary. If you have the fortune of being able to move up to one of the more premium licenses, and it's not just E5, by the way, there's other sort of bolt-on licenses that are in between, specifically in the information compliance area. But if you happen to have one of those licenses available for your users, then you can potentially step up. And in that step up, it's the retention labels that really benefit. The retention policies are pretty much identical with E3 or the more premium licenses. So all of the things you're missing out on are really around retention labels mostly. But whichever of these you look at, whichever approach you go with, with E3, you've got two different modes that they can be configured. So you can either have them in retention mode, which it doesn't prevent deletion, but what it does is it makes sure you keep the content. I know that sounds a bit different, but what it means is, certainly with the retention policy, you can click delete and the file will disappear, but it's caught and held behind the scenes in a location called the preservation hold library, if it's in SharePoint, or in a hidden folder behind your inbox is called the substrat hold folder. And it ends up catching that content and retaining it for the remainder of the retention period, which is a double-edged sword. I'll get to that later. But you can also configure it not in retention mode. You can configure both policies and also labels in deletion mode, should we say. And deletion mode doesn't really do anything to do with retention. Nothing at all. If you hit delete, the content just gets deleted. It goes through the standard recycle bins and then disappears from your tenant altogether. This, however, at the end of let's not call it retention period, at the end of the deletion period, it will automatically allow you to delete down that file though. So that's quite useful in some scenarios. And some people do find that it does give them sort of a baby step towards improved compliance. But it's certainly not records management. You've also got, with E3 licenses, you've got quite limited options for how you trigger the start of a retention period. So with either retention policies or retention labels, you've only got two options with an E3 license. And that is to trigger the start of a retention period around the date created, or to trigger it around the date modified. So it's very much all focused upon files being added and changed. And this, well, I've seen countless retention schedules. Not many triggers on a retention schedule typically revolve around dates of content being created or modified. Very often, from my experience, it's all around things such as content being superseded, or around the sale of an asset, or a staff member leaving. And these more real world scenarios cannot easily be accommodated with the out-of-the-box sort of basic triggers that you get with an E3 for either retention policies or retention labels. So very often with E3, you'll find yourself having to, I guess, make a lot of compromise in the way that you start triggering retention. Now, at the end of the retention period, again, with either of these options, retention policies or retention labels, with E3 licenses, you do not get access to some of the more advanced capabilities around ending retention. So realistically, you have the ability to automatically delete content down at the end of the retention period, or alternatively, the other option is to something Microsoft used to call doing nothing. But what it really means is that the retention rules no longer apply to that item. So in other words, after the retention period is finished, in theory, if a user clicks delete on that file, it's no longer caught and held behind the scenes. So, quick overview of what you get. It's quite rudimentary, basic governance capabilities, really. Certainly, you will not hear Microsoft using the word record in anything related to E3. Record, in Microsoft's terms, is a specific part of that's only available with a more premium license. So what do you get? What are you missing out on, I guess, if you, which of the capabilities of an E5 are you not having access to? Well, the first of these is the disposition review process. So only available with retention labels, not retention policies. If you are lucky enough to have a premium license, then you do get access to a disposition review process. I'm not going to pretend this is a perfect process by any stretch of the imagination. It's quite rigid. It's not particularly flexible. You can have several stages, up to 5 stages. But more importantly, now you can start delegating it across an organization. So you can have different people reviewing different types of content based upon the labels that are being applied. So it is quite powerful in some regards, but it's very focused upon disposition. It's not really, there's no options in there at the moment for, say, marking items that need to be transferred to an archive or to a different location. It's really around making decisions around the deletion process. But still, it's something that you only get with the premium licenses. Immutability, as I was mentioning before, the word record itself is something that Microsoft only refer to specifically around immutability. So the record label is a variant of the retention label that will lock and prevent changes to an item. So I say lock and prevent changes. Microsoft over the last year or so have introduced a flick switch. Some of you might be available that sort of turns on and off immutability. What it's actually doing is creating extra versions behind the scenes. So it's storing multiple versions of the same file every time you choose to make it mutable again. I know it doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but the concept of immutability is only available with a premium license. So it's quite frustrating at times. Event-based retention, again, I alluded to this around the advanced triggers at the start of retention. Limited, as I said before, to triggering the start of retention with created and modified dates. With retention labels, at least with a premium license, you have access to much more advanced capabilities using event-based retention. This allows you, for example, for one of my clients, I've automated this around calendar events. So, every time the end of the calendar year, we can automatically start triggering retention on specific files that happen to have the retention schedules based around calendar and financial year. But it could be you could use event-based retention around almost any type of activity that has an event and a process. So a staff member leaving, or the sale of a property, or whatever it happens to be. In theory, if there's a process there, event-based retention would allow you to trigger the start of retention around that process. So quite powerful, but it does get a little bit complex at times. Unfortunately, something that you're missing out on. Adaptive scopes. Now, to me, this is frustrating and a bit of a biggie, because adaptive scopes, let me explain what they do, but so the word on the street from Microsoft is always use adaptive scopes over static scopes if you have any choice at all. Unfortunately, with E3 licenses, you've only got static scopes, which have been described as a little bit more error prone than the adaptive ones. Adaptive scopes, let me explain. What they are is they're a mechanism for pushing retention out to different parts of the Microsoft 365 tenant. Unlike this, with an E3 license, the way you do it is very static. You push your retention out to, say, all SharePoint sites, or you push it out to specific named SharePoint sites, or all inboxes or specific named inboxes. With an adaptive scope, instead, you set up rules almost for how you're pushing the retention rules out. This could be either retention labels, a group of labels, or it could be a retention policy. What you do is you create a dynamic rule that says, push this out to all of my SharePoint sites that happen to be tagged as belonging to the finance team. Or push this out to all of my users who in their properties, against the user, they're working out of the London office, or they happen to be in the role of nuclear scientists or something. So you can set up these dynamic rules. And the benefit of adaptive scopes is not only are they less error prone, shall we say, than the static scopes, but the other benefit is that they are dynamically applied. So you can imagine, let's say there's a person in your HR team. You could push out retention to them, to let's say their inbox, that relates to the fact they're in the HR team. So you could push out HR related retention labels or a retention policy. But let's say they change role and suddenly join the finance team. You could have the adaptive scopes, you wouldn't need to change anything, you wouldn't need to configure anything. The finance retention would automatically be then applied if you've set up separate retention based on departments, say. So very powerful, and unfortunately you don't have access to them. Next and last is there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can actually automatically apply retention labels. Don't want to labor too much on the things you don't have access to, but a very high level keyword query gives you the ability to set up a query that finds all of the content in your environment that happens to have, say, specific keyword phrases or sentences, whatever it happens to be, inside the body of the file, or has specific metadata that it's being tagged with, or even sensitivity labels that it's being tagged with. And you can use any combination of that to say, well, if it's got this phrase and has this, being classified as important, or whatever the metadata happens to be, then I will tag it automatically with the retention label. And this is really useful if you've got a large, I call it a digital heap, a big, large pile of SharePoint sites filled with old legacy content. Perhaps you've migrated it in. Keyword query is quite a good way of starting to claw back some of that by identifying content of a specific type. Sensitive information types, think of this as passport numbers and credit card numbers and that sort of thing. It's those repeating regular codes that you often have in different types of content across an environment. To me, this is quite a niche application, but if you can scan all of your content and anything that contains, say, a credit card number, automatically apply a retention label to it, it's quite a powerful tool, but quite niche and works better in some organizations than others. Trainable classifiers, again, incredibly powerful, but it's an AI-based tool. What you're doing is you're feeding the AI, you're training it with multiple examples of the same type of content. And the AI will learn after you've given it at least 50 let's say it's a policy. You feed that trainable classifier 50 examples of a policy, and then it will scan the whole rest of your Microsoft 365 environment and find everything else that it thinks looks like a policy, and it will automatically classify it with a retention label. And all of that's useful, especially if you want to claw, through a large digital heap of information. But it's this last one here that unfortunately is probably the biggest gotcha. Because many of you, I've come across so many organizations who have E3 licenses and are using default labels. Technically, you have the ability to set a default label. It's there in your tenant. Anyone who's got the ability to modify a document library can set a default retention label on that library that will be automatically inherited by all of the content that's added into that library. You do the same at a folder level. But while you've been given the technical ability to do it, even with an E3 license or an E1 license, the licensing that Microsoft has published says, no, this requires a premium license. And it's a horrible thing. When they first introduced this about 3 years ago, I was really angry. I don't mind letting you know, but effectively I thought it was a really bad step. The fact that you could still, I would imagine there's people on this call who are in breach of this right now, and possibly it's a fundamental part of how they've chosen to apply retention using E3 labels, but technically it's in breach of the licensing. And while don't know if Microsoft's going to ever clamp down or, perhaps back off and actually make this available with E3 at some point in the future. For me, it's a very big frustration that default labeling is something that does require, unfortunately, a premium license at this stage. But let's have a look at, for anyone really concerned, let's have a look at some potential workarounds for that later. Okay, before we move on, just check in case there's any questions, because of course I can't see everything. Oh gosh, I see there's lots of people commenting on lots of different things. I'll probably have to catch up with some of this later.
Yeah. There are 2 questions in the question tab, Rob, but they're for the end of the session. They're not ones that need to be answered this second.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll just keep skipping between different things as needed, but certainly let's keep going then. So let's look at some of the options, I guess, because the E3 license is fairly limited in terms of what it provides. There's always been some fairly sort of similar architectures that I've seen repeated by various different organizations. And I'm not saying any of these are perfect, but some of them might be things that you haven't thought about or perhaps open up opportunities for you. But let's have a look. So by far the most obvious, it's almost the de facto, I guess, is relying on manual application of retention labels. And we all know really what this leads to. I mean, it's simple, relatively simple to set up. It's not very difficult to push retention labels out to make them available in workspaces. But obviously, it's got major flaws with this approach because you're relying very heavily upon your staff. And I've never seen really in most organizations, certainly, it's very rare for people to actually be able to be relied upon to classify things correctly. No one likes tagging things. There are exceptions, though. I've seen this approach work pretty well in organizations where information management is very seriously taken as a serious and important part of the process. So, for example, small pharmaceutical organizations who are involved in clinical drug trials, they're absolutely precise. Every member of staff knows that everything's got to be moved from one stage to the next, and they understand that doing things correctly and classifying things correctly, it very often is essential. And if they want to ever get the drug through the clinical test. So actually, in scenarios such as that, I've seen fairly high quality of manual classification of retention labels. And you see this in other organizations too. So I've seen this in, say, lots in the finance sector and in the legal sector, where being precise and being accurate is important. Of course, we're talking to the public sector group today. And I think the public sector is a very wide group of different types of organizations. In many of them, manual classification is just going to go down like a lead balloon. It's just going to fail really badly. People don't have time to really think about the importance of information governance in addition to everything else they have to do. But for some parts of the public sector, specifically those that happen to be working more towards archival or registries, it might be a viable approach. Okay, probably not good for everyone. So the next approach, and one of the ones I've seen used more commonly, I guess, across people in the public sector who have happened to be stuck on E3 licenses, is to make use of retention policies, almost as the background retention by stealth, and apply a whole series of different retention policies across all of the different sites and OneDrive accounts, etc., across the tenant. I have to admit, I'm not a big fan of this approach technically. I know there are lots of people out there that champion this. For example, I understand that the Dutch government has moved more heavily in this direction. But there are certainly positives. It's incredibly easy to set up, much more easy than even pushing out the retention labels to the different workspaces. It does have a fairly low compliance accuracy, as I mentioned before. If it's a one-size-fits-all approach on a site, there's no way of distinguishing different content inside that same site as being higher or lower value than other content and having different retention applied to it, unfortunately. But by far, my biggest concern with this approach is around GDPR. You see, content that is deleted using retention policies will always end up being pushed into these hidden locations behind the scenes for the remainder of the retention period. So the preservation hold libraries in SharePoint will always catch the content that's being deleted if you delete it, say, 3 years into a 7-year retention. And once it's in that preservation hold library, there's nothing you can do. It's there. It's permanently there for the remainder of that retention period. For the next 4 years, that file is in your tenant. Your admins can't remove it. Microsoft won't remove it for you. Developers can't get to it with code. It's your content. You're keeping it. Now, the reason this concerns me is imagine you, I don't know, have a GDPR right to be forgotten scenario, or you stumble across a file containing, I don't know, a whole list of credit card numbers and you realize that you have no legitimate need to keep it anymore. The instinct of most members of staff is to hit the delete key straight away, remove that item. Doing so would be a big mistake because as soon as you hit delete, it's caught behind the scenes and then you're stuck with it. It will, when I say behind the scenes, yes, it's not in your face. Yes, you don't see it as an end user, but if you undertake a e-discovery case or if you undertake a subject access request, it's still brought back in the results. It's still your content, you're still possessing it. I think you can probably, some of you might be disagreeing with me, but I think many of you will probably agree that there's a huge GDPR headache, I think, for anyone who is applying background retention policies across their sites. A variant of the background retention policy approach, though, that I've seen some organizations choose to use is background deletion. Now, this is better because, of course, with deletion policies, if you click delete, the content is deleted. It's not caught behind the scenes. But of course, from a records management perspective, we're only really doing one part of what, the core ethos of what we're trying to achieve. We're doing the timely deletion side of the story, but we're not doing the making sure that we're keeping the content of value for the duration we need to keep it side of the story. So it's relatively low level of compliance overall. It's very easy to set up. It's very, similar to the background retention, for retention policies. Background deletion, incredibly easy to set up, but you've got no retention. The overall quality of the governance being applied is fairly low. But one quite nice benefit is that I don't want to get into too much of the principles of retention, but I'm sure some of you on this call will have heard of the principles of retention, which are Microsoft's way of choosing when there's a clash between two different retention rules. Now, with retention will always, in the principles of retention, supersede deletion. So the retention rule will always work before the deletion rule kicks in. So if you've got background deletion policies, your retention, if you then choose to, in addition to those, apply retention labels over the top, the retention label will always take precedence over any attempt to delete the content. So it does allow you more control to pick out individual items if needed. So that's quite nice with this approach. But again, I think some of you, this might be incredibly, I was speaking to an organization last week and this approach seemed to be perfect for them as an organization. Very simple to apply, very simple to extend, but perhaps fairly low governance overall. It might be appropriate for some of you simply need to go further. The last approach I've seen that lots of organizations with E3 licenses attempt or move towards is moving to a record area. So what they do is they have a separate area, typically SharePoint sites, that they build out a more elaborate, more advanced records management solution. Then the only people who have edit access in that area are a limited group of records managers. And this means that because they're the only people with edit access, they can be granted a handful, 3, 5, 10, maybe, E5 or other premium licenses. And this means that that small group suddenly has access in that area, in the records hub, let's call it, to all of the advanced premium capabilities such as disposition review that we've mentioned before. Everybody else works in a whole array of other teams and SharePoint sites. And this is where some of the problems with this approach come in, because content is created in one location and there needs to be somehow identified so it can be moved across and stored in the records space. And the process of you relying on typically end users to identify the content that needs to be transferred, because very often this approach just sees blanket deletion being applied to all of the working areas and tries to encourage the record area to almost become a read-only knowledge repository, if you like, so that people can, across the organization, access it, view it, and see the records that are being retained there. There might be some exceptions. You might lock down certain parts of it, especially around employment information and things. But it can be a very effective approach because it gives you access to all of the capabilities of E5 without having the licensing. But the downside is, how do you identify, how do you encourage people to flag up this needs to be retained for longer? So I think I've covered all of that. And yeah, obviously you get access to the advanced stuff. Now, there might be other models that other people have out there. And certainly if anyone's got a different alternative with E3, I'd love to know. But these are the ones that I've seen time and time again that people who happen to be on E3 licenses have to pick between. I'm sure there might be questions later. So let's take a quick look at a few. I'm not going to say these are perfect, but they might help stimulate ideas or encourage you to think in different directions around what you can do with an E3 license to perhaps step up a little bit or improve upon it with perhaps some light investment or light development. So let's take this example. What we've got here is a SharePoint site that I've built. There's nothing particularly special going on here. It's just a human resources site. And you can see that we've got the out-of-the-box retention label column. Now, if you remember, before I told you cannot, with an E3 license, you're not licensed to set a default retention label. You see, so behind the scenes in the library settings, you've got this page that says apply label, and you've got the drop-down list where you can choose a default. You will all have this ability, technically, to do this in your tenants with E3 licenses. However, this drop-down list is something that you can't use because you're not licensed to, even though technically you can use it. It's very confusing. So obviously, this would be the solution you'd go with if you happen to have E5 licenses. You just set default retention labels across this library, because then everything that gets put into this, in this case, it's employment documentation library, would be automatically classified. What I'm thinking is there a way that we could actually build something simple that simulates the same thing without breaching the license? So what I thought is I'd introduce another column here. So instead of just retention label, I've created a new column. This is a manage metadata column. So this default retention, I've created it as a managed metadata column, and you can see behind the scenes here, HR, appraisals, attendance, etc. This is all coming from the SharePoint's term store. So these are terms that I've created behind the scenes in the term store. And what I've got is each term corresponds to one of the retention labels that happens to be pushed out to this site. So there's a retention label called appraisals. I've created a term called appraisals with an identical name. Now, the reason for this is I can set a default value on a SharePoint column with an E3 license. I'm sure many of you are already doing this. So in this scenario, I have chosen to set the health and well-being managed metadata term as being the default. So that any content that gets added to this library will be automatically tagged with that term. But this doesn't help us yet apply the retention label. This is where I built a workflow process. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Power Automate, and I know this looks horribly techy and horribly codey. I'm showing you this so that in theory you could take a screenshot of this at some point and pass it to the techies in your team, and they will be able to build something like this fairly easily for you. But what you're looking at here is actually a fairly simple few-step workflow process that will automatically wake up this first step at the top there. You see, when an item is created or modified, it just means whenever a file is added or edited inside that library, it wakes up the process. I'll come back to this second stage because this adds a bit of complexity, but it makes it work a bit better. It's really this third stage that's more important at this to understand, and that is whenever the process runs, it will automatically take whatever you've got in that managed metadata column, you know, the default retention column that I created with the terms, it will take that and then apply the corresponding retention label. So it sets the retention label whenever the metadata is set. Now, just for completeness, and I'm not going to go into any detail here at all, but just for completeness, I want to show what the middle stage is doing. I'm not going to go into it, but this screenshot would help you build out that middle, the whole of the workflow process if you wanted to. So this is version number equal to one step is actually saying, is this a new file being added or is this an existing file being edited? And what you're really doing here is you're only, then you do an additional check to say, is the retention label that's already on this file, if there is one, different from the managed metadata classification that's already on the file, if there is one. And only if they are different does it then cause this update, the correct managed metadata term to be applied as a retention label. But don't worry, I know I've gone beyond technical complexity for many of the people here. This, if you did want to pass it to any techies in your team, would allow them to build out this workflow process. Now, let me show you what this actually does though. So back in our document library, imagine I upload, in this case, a PDF. Within a few seconds, it will get the default managed metadata term very, very quickly, because that was set as a default value. And then behind the scenes, that workflow process wakes up and actually then automatically will take that default retention term of health and well-being and apply it as a retention label. So in effect, what you've got is you've built default retention that you don't have licenses to do, but you've done it without breaching your license, if you see what I mean. It's a bit clunky, it's a bit of an extra development that's needed there, very minor, but what you've achieved is effectively the same end result. Now, a slight word of warning here. Power Automate is really powerful. It's an incredible tool. It can be a little bit complicated to get into, but I'm sure there's many people in your organization who can help you with that. But the thing I want to warn you about with Power Automate is you almost need to build that process for each library. And for, let's say, a small organization, you might have 20, 40, 50 libraries scattered across different sites. It might be just about doable, just about viable that you can start manually building this workflow in different places. Once you're into, say, more than 100 staff, you're going to have a lot of different teams and sites that you're going to want to build something like this in. And as soon as you get to that sort of scale, I'd advise not triggering a Power Automate flow process. Instead, I would recommend getting a little bit of development assistance and hosting some logic in Azure. And I'm not going to go into any details here at all, but you can trigger processes in Azure that do exactly the same thing to bypass any need for maintaining hundreds and hundreds of separate workflows. You can maintain and deploy one central sort of process that, again, helps you bypass the need for perhaps it will give you the sort of default capability of retention labels without actually breaching the licensing that you've got with E3. And it might well, for some of you, help, I guess, significantly extend the E3 so that you don't perhaps miss out on so many of the capabilities. It's only one of the missing capabilities, though. So let me show you another one. I'm not going to go into as much details on this one. I'll keep it much higher level because I'm not going to show you processes behind the scenes or bore you all silly showing you workflows. But what I wanted to just explain was you could do something similar to simulate immutability. It's not perfect. It's not ever actually going to do the same as a record label and lock things down. But in theory, what you could do is have a process where, let's say, you select a couple of these the files in a library. And you can introduce, this will need a developer, almost certainly, you can introduce buttons into the architecture of SharePoint. In this case, this is a SharePoint framework extension command set. Don't worry, you don't need to know any of that, but this SharePoint framework extension command set, let's just call it a button, triggers a process. So that any files, it doesn't matter how many you would select, you could automatically start a process to lock them. But what does locking them mean? Well, imagine we click that button. What we could do in theory is, let's say, remove permissions from the files that are being locked. So they are read-only files from that point onwards. They can't be shared. Well, they can be shared, but only as read-only files. They can't be shared for someone else to edit them. Only an administrator would be able to reapply the permissions back to those files. And as you can see here, we've done something with column formatting. So column formatting allows us to visually display different parts of the SharePoint library to make it more obvious. And all we've done here is applied a little padlock logo and painted the background color gray just to make it visually clear that these are now locked And if you did open them, they would be in read-only mode. But behind the scenes, that process that then is running to lock, almost certainly you'd probably want to build that in Azure, I'd imagine. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I'm just trying to say there are ways and means with some of the limitations that you get with E3 of perhaps engaging in a small sort of development project of some description. Maybe it's something your internal IT team could do that would actually, for a substantially lower price than moving to an E5 license, start to close some of those gaps. I recognize that not every gap can be closed, but it's certainly worth looking at the areas that are important to you and thinking, can we viably get more out of the E3 license than just using it out of the box? So I guess I'll start wrapping up here, but what I'm really thinking here is, are we actually able to manage records with an E3 license? And it's very hard for me to say yes or no. I don't think you can really do full records management. I think that's really clear to everyone. You certainly cannot get anywhere close to, say, any of the international standards, 15489, for example. You can't get close to any of these just with E3 licenses. Shout if any of you think that I'm wrong on that, because I'd love to know. I personally feel, however, you can have improved governance, and depending on how far you want to get, E3 license can be actually twisted into something that can be quite powerful. It can be certainly far better than, say, if you've come from a file share in the past and literally no governance being applied at all. So it really depends on you as an organization and quite how far and quite how detailed you want to take your governance story. So can it manage records? Not really, but maybe is probably my conclusion. Let's see if anyone's got any questions. Let's wrap up there.
Okay, so there are 3 questions in the questions tab, Rob. I don't know whether, can you see the questions tab?
Yes, I can. Okay. So I will read out the first question and see what I make of it. So on the move to record area, you said a small area could be given E5 licenses. I thought that this was original advice given, but now it is the case that you can't have E5 within a mostly E3 area. Is this a breach of the license? So every person, to answer the question, let me actually click the button to start live answering. So my understanding that the way that the licenses work is that every person who can modify a file in a space needs to be given the licenses that you're using in that space. So for example, if you are using, say, a disposition review or record label, every person who can modify content in the areas that those are being used would need to be given a premium license. So this means that if you've got this, let's call it a SharePoint hub, and you've got 10 SharePoint sites as your records management hub of some description, if the only people in that hub are, say, 3 records managers who have edit access and everybody else has view access, my understanding is that everyone else with view read-only access would only need E3 licenses, and the 3 records managers would be able to have the E5 licenses because they're the only ones who can modify content in that area. And as such, you would be able to, using just those 3 E5 licenses, take advantage of all of the records management capabilities that come with the E5 license. Now, I would urge anyone relying on my guidance that things could change. Tomorrow they could publish a whole new set of licensing rules. So please refer to Microsoft's licensing information and to have a look at the latest information there. But certainly, I believe at the moment you certainly can get away. It's not a breach of the rules. Hope that answered the question. Okay, next question down. Can you also share at the end of the session, Rob, where on the MS roadmap they are planning to enhance their disposition review process for E5? Okay, let me try and start answering the question. So there's the disposition review process is something that I'd quite like to see them enhance. It's something that I have actually been trying to put pressure on Erica and Roberto to improve. I'd really like to see personally more flexibility into that process so that we could perhaps branch off and have sensitivity reviews and then come back into the main review. I'd really like to see some form of options around transfer so that you could at least mark content so it becomes classified in a way that then you could have a separate process that scans and finds all the content that needs to be moved to an archive, let's say. I'm not aware of either of those being on the Microsoft 365 roadmap, despite my pressure, which is a real shame. But certainly what Microsoft have recently introduced is the ability to trigger, and I've left this out of my presentation because I've not seen the licensing on it. My understanding is it's probably E5, but or similar. But I might be wrong on this, so maybe this is E3, but the ability to trigger a Power Automate workflow process at the end of a retention period is something that was really made available by Microsoft back in May. They also had another option which allows you to automatically call into start say a process in Azure, for example, using a webhook. But those processes give you the ability to build your own disposition review process to a certain extent. So in theory, you could trigger a process that does anything you want, goes through as many steps and calls as many people, delegates to people who are on leave, all of the different things that are actually missing, if you like, from the main disposition review process that Microsoft's provided. So they've given you the ability to build your own. There are some limitations with that because Microsoft's disposition review process does some magic around permissions for reviewers. I know it's not magic, but they sort of provide when a file or when a record is pending review, the current group of reviewers are granted the ability to view that file through the disposition review process, even if they don't have rights to view the file if they went to, say, the SharePoint site or OneDrive account, but they can through the disposition review process. And that magic level of permissions is something that we can't recreate inside, say, a workflow process, which is a little bit limiting. But I hope that answered the question. Next question down, not a question for now, but we want to focus on E3. But at the end, could you please tell us about the bolt-on? I can't see, looks like there's another line to the question, but I can't see it, which is a bit frustrating, this interface. I'm wondering what the bolt-on is in terms of, bolt-on licenses between E3 and E5. Perhaps this could be a possibility for us. So yeah, there's a whole combination of different licenses that are available as bolt-on options. I don't have their names in front of me, but I think it's something like Microsoft E5 Information and Compliance or something off the top of my head. And they had another one that they removed. I can certainly dig that out and try and find it after this session's finished. But there are a couple of licenses, and what they do is instead of granting you the whole array of E5 features, they just grant those in the specific sort of information and compliance space. So you get the extended capabilities, but you're not paying the full E5 price. The price is, however, approximately, say, at least 50%. I think it's about 2/3 of the price of the step gap, if you like, from E3 up to E5. So certainly for many organizations, when they look at the business case rationale for moving from E3 to E5 and they see a big number, if you think about 2/3 of that number, it's still a very big number in many cases, but you're getting far less than 2/3 of the functionality because you're only getting a very limited amount specifically in the information and compliance space. What you're not getting is, say, anything in telephony or any of the more advanced security capabilities, etc., that are available across Microsoft 365 with an E5 license. So some people do use them very viably. Many have chosen to go the whole hog to the E5 simply because, you know, it is, if you want everything, it is better value for money. I know that might sound very odd to say, but hopefully that answers your question. Next one, do you need to have a set role to be able to apply some of the retention elements in E3, e.g. compliance administrator role, etc.? Right, so yeah, the permissions inside Microsoft Purview are brilliant, aren't they? There's a load of different permissions that you need to have access to and you can configure. And honestly, anyone who pretends to understand them, I think, is probably lying. So I'm not going to actually sit here and say, yes, I've been through every one of those permissions and I've tested exactly what they're all doing. Many of them are not entirely relevant to what we're doing. But to be able to apply some of the retention elements, the short answer is yes. But typically to be able to set them up, I typically find is that you tend to use an administrative role. So yes, the compliance administrator. I tend to, it depends on the tenant, it depends on how you are managing permissions in this space. But certainly you're going to want to have different roles for people so that not everybody has the ability to set this up, of course. But within Microsoft Purview, one of the things I tend to push for is that I personally think Purview is a space that should be primarily owned by the KIM team. Very often I come across it that it's sort of owned by the IT team entirely. They're making decisions around it. And I almost think that most of the capabilities in there, while some of them people in information security and IT might need access to, I think that KIM should almost hold the keys to the Purview kingdom and define the roles that are appropriate for other people to come in and access. So certainly, for example, someone undertaking disposition review should be granted the disposition reviewer role, whereas yes, you tend to configure the retention elements under a very high level administrative permission. Again, hope that answers the question, but I don't have the complete list of permissions in front of me. Next question, can you just use the delete key when required? E.g., produce a list of leavers from the HR MIS who have left 6 years ago and then go and delete their folders in the HR SharePoint site. I'm assuming that this question is referring to if you've got retention being applied, can you just hit the delete key? Well, if there's retention applied, whether we're talking, well, let's talk retention policy. If you've got a retention policy that's on that, let's say, SharePoint site, and you've got files there, you hit delete, no, they're going to get caught behind the scenes, they will not be deleted. If it's a deletion policy, you hit delete, they will go into the standard recycle bin and go through the standard process of being deleted down. With retention labels, it's slightly more complicated. So if you've got a retention label applied, there's two ways you can configure your retention label. Behind the scenes in the records management section of Microsoft Purview, what you've got is a records management settings page. You can find this, there's a cog in the top right-hand corner, not the normal cog you click on right in the sweep bar. There's another cog that appears below that, just in the records management page of Microsoft Purview. And that takes you to a records management settings. And on that page, you've got the option to prevent, I think they've called it prevent deletion of, or allow deletion of SharePoint items. And what this means is you've got almost an on-off switch in SharePoint, and it's the same in OneDrive, another on-off switch. But if you allow deletion, what it really means is that when you, with a retention label, when you click delete, it does exactly the same as a retention policy. It catches it and holds it in the preservation hold library behind the scenes. Whereas if you turn that setting the other way, right across your tenancy, anywhere with a retention label in SharePoint, when you hit delete, instead, you'll see the traditional old error message that many of you will be familiar with that says, I'm sorry, can't, well, it's not that polite. It says something like, can't be deleted because of a policy that's being applied to this. So that error message can be quite frustrating for users, but many organizations I've seen have trained their staff to, if they need to delete something that's protected by a retention label, when that error message is shown, they get the, they've trained staff to remove the retention label, so set it to none, then click delete. And doing so actually then sends it through the standard recycle bin process and will delete down the content. So the answer to your question, can you just use the delete key? It depends how you configured retention, but potentially only with retention labels and only if you've set them to prevent content from being deleted in that records management settings page. Hope that sort of helps. Otherwise, you will get content caught inside the preservation hold library and it will just end up there for the rest of the retention period. Okay, the next one. Is it possible to make the addition of a manual retention label part of the saving process, i.e. a file cannot be saved without a retention label being created? Oh, I wish it were. One of my requests I've been trying to make to Microsoft is giving us the ability to make this the retention labels mandatory. What I really want to do is not make them mandatory at a tenant level. Who wants to, in some scenarios, for example, the scenario I was just answering in the previous question, where you do indeed have a legitimate need to remove a retention label and set it to none, so you can click delete so that the content isn't accidentally sent and stored behind the scenes in the preservation hold library. There might be some scenarios where you do like that, need to have legitimate reason to delete, not have this as a mandatory field. Having said that, I think there are other scenarios where having the flexibility to make it mandatory would be really, really useful. Unfortunately, there's no way of making it mandatory out of the box at the moment. So one thing I did build with one organization was a process that almost tried to identify places where the retention labels had been removed. Now, this isn't perfect, but certainly if people haven't set retention on content, it wasn't my name for this, but the organization involved referred to this as the Nagger. And it's a piece of software that was effectively scanning across the scenes in the background and finding every location that didn't have retention labels, and then starting to get in touch with the local owners of those workspaces and say, you need to apply retention to this content. Now, it's not a perfect solution, certainly doesn't replace being able to either set a default or similar, but you can't sort of enforce application of retention labels, unfortunately, at the point that you save a file, which is really frustrating. Okay, next question. I noticed you haven't mentioned content types at all, Rob. Do these figure any more in potential E3 approach to records management? So content types are still a very important part of Microsoft 365's architecture, and you certainly should be considering using them anytime you're really looking at custom metadata. That said, especially where with the architecture of Microsoft Teams, new teams are being spun up all the time, and they have separate sites behind those teams. And those sites, by default, unless you're controlling the creation of Microsoft Teams, will not have content. They'll use the out-of-the-box document content type, not your custom content types. Likewise, if you're in a team and you click private channel and you create a new private channel, or the brand new shared channel that came out in July, it creates more SharePoint sites behind the scenes. I've given up counting how many SharePoint sites you can physically have behind a team now. So each of those SharePoint sites will not have the correct content types applied by default, unless you're intercepting them, which we're doing with some organizations, intercepting the creation of new private channels and automatically extending content types to them. Another scenario where they don't apply very well is in a standard SharePoint site and someone creates a new document library. That new document library will always have the out-of-the-box document content type applied and not your custom ones. That said, if you can apply content types, you should. Certainly, I personally think it's a real risk. I've seen some people editing the out-of-the-box document content type. I strongly urge people not to do that if they are doing so, because I think Microsoft could change it if they wanted to. It's almost on their side of the fence, so your metadata could be wiped out if you do edit the out-of-the-box document content type. So I do think content types are important, and I would use them wherever you can. I do think very often that requires a bit of automation, though. But with regard to records management specifically, the retention labels and retention policies have nothing anymore to do with content types. So back in the days of the legacy records management approaches that you're probably familiar with in SharePoint, the old Record Center and the SharePoint 2013 in-place records management solutions, very heavily focused upon content types. The old information management policies would trigger, you could apply them through folders or you could apply them through content types, and content types were a very essential part of the records management architecture back then. But no, with retention labels and retention policies, content types are still useful, but more for metadata and less for retention. Unless there's a change that Microsoft's made that I haven't kept on top of. That said, still carry on use content types wherever you possibly can. One word of warning, having just mentioned the legacy record centers and in-place records management, if you're still using them, please, Microsoft hasn't said anything yet around any of these capabilities, but I'd strongly urge you to start considering moving away from those legacy capabilities. So that's both the SharePoint 2010 record center and also the SharePoint 2013 capability around in-place records management, I can't see both of them lasting forever. Let's put it that way. And that's time, I would imagine. There's no more questions.
No, we're just coming up to exactly on an hour, so that's a really good timing. So I would like to say a huge thank you to Rob for spending the time to share his expertise and ideas with us. As always, the group is very reliant on experts like Rob in being willing to share their time and energy with us. So I would like to say a huge thank you to Rob, and to say that obviously this is the last event of 2022. I'm currently in the process of putting the 2023 programme together, so many thanks to everyone who responded to the consultation, and watch the IRMS website for details of the 2023 programme. And in the meantime, it's far too early really, but I will say I hope everyone has a very pleasant Christmas, and I will look forward to seeing everybody in 2023. So thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.